Microsoft just handed millions of people an ultimatum they never asked for. Windows 10 is dead. Windows 11 demands hardware most people simply do not have. And the ones who do upgrade are walking straight into a wall of forced ads, mandatory Microsoft accounts, and an AI assistant that watches everything you do. So people are leaving. Not a few thousand, not a niche crowd of tech hobbyists. We are talking about millions of everyday users who just want their computer to work without being spied on, slowed down, or taxed for existing. The single biggest reason most of them have not already made the switch to Linux comes down to one fear that nobody likes to admit out loud. They are scared it will not feel familiar. They are scared it will look like something from a science class in 1998, full of terminal commands and cryptic file systems that only programmers understand. Here's the truth. Nobody is saying loudly enough. There are Linux distributions available right now in 2026 that feel so much like Windows that the average person will not even realize they have switched. The taskbar is in the same place. The start menu works the same way. The right-click menus, the file manager, the settings panel, all of it is designed so that your muscle memory from years of using Windows carries over without you having to relearn a single thing. This video is going to walk you through 7 of those distros, ranked and explained for the kind of person who just wants a reliable, fast, private computer that does not fight them every morning. So stay until the end, because the last distro on this list is one that almost nobody is talking about, and it might be the most important one for people switching from Windows 10 specifically. Let us start with Zorin OS, and if you have spent any time researching Linux alternatives to Windows, this name has probably already come up. Zorin OS is built on Ubuntu, which means it sits on one of the most stable and well-supported foundations in the Linux world. But what makes Zorin different from Ubuntu itself is that the entire desktop has been designed from the ground up to replicate the experience of being a Windows user. When you first boot into Zorin OS, you are greeted with a taskbar at the bottom of the screen that looks and behaves almost identically to the Windows 11 taskbar. The app icons sit centered at the bottom. There's a start menu style launcher on the left. There's a system tray on the right, and the whole thing just clicks into place immediately for anyone coming from Windows. Zorin includes something called Zorin Appearance, which is a built-in tool that lets you switch the desktop layout with literally one click. You can make it look like Windows 11, Windows 7, or even Mac OS if you want. It gives new users a level of control over the visual experience that no other distro provides, so simply and cleanly. The free version of Zorin is already incredibly powerful and usable for everyday tasks. There is also a pro version that unlocks additional layout options and comes with a bundle of pre-installed productivity software. But for most people who are just making the switch, the free core edition is more than enough. Zorin also ships with wine compatibility pre-configured, which means many Windows applications can run on it without requiring technical knowledge or additional setup. The hardware support is solid, the driver detection works reliably on most modern laptops and desktops, and the update system is straightforward enough that even someone who has never used Linux before will feel confident managing it. In 2026, Zorin OS 18 continues to refine everything that made version 17 popular, and it remains the single most recommended distro for Windows users who want a polished, ready-to-use experience with zero Linux knowledge required. If you are the kind of person who needs everything to just work from day one, Zorin OS is probably your safest first choice. The second distro on this list is Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop, and if Zorin OS is the polished beginner choice, Linux Mint is the one that the Linux community itself reaches for when they want something rock solid and dependably familiar. Linux Mint Cinnamon has consistently ranked as one of the most downloaded Linux distributions in the world for years. And in 2026, that popularity has only grown stronger as Windows 10 refugees flood into the Linux world looking for a stable home. The Cinnamon desktop environment was actually developed by the Linux Mint team themselves, specifically because they wanted a desktop that felt natural to Windows users without sacrificing modern functionality. It gives you a classic taskbar at the bottom, a start menu in the bottom left corner, a notification tray in the bottom right, and a desktop layout that almost any Windows 7 or Windows 10 user will find immediately intuitive. The file manager in Linux Mint is called Nemo, and it is one of the most user-friendly file managers available on any operating system. It behaves almost exactly like Windows Explorer with the same panel layout, the same ability to copy and paste using familiar keyboard shortcuts, and the same kind of right-click menus that feel completely natural without any learning curve. Linux Mint ships with a full suite of media codecs pre-installed, which means videos, music, and DVDs just work out of the box without requiring additional downloads or configuration steps that confuse new users. The Update Manager is one of the best in the Linux world because it categorizes updates by risk level, meaning you never have to wonder whether an update might break your system. It gives you full control while keeping the process simple enough for non-technical users to manage confidently. Linux Mint is also famously conservative about major changes, which means the experience is stable and predictable from release to release. When you sit down at a Linux Mint Cinnamon desktop after years OF using Windows, your hands already know where everything is. That is not an accident. That is the entire design philosophy of this distribution. Number 3 is Linux X, also known as Windows FX. And this one is for the people who want the most visually convincing Windows clone available in the entire Linux ecosystem. Linux FX is built on Ubuntu 24.04 LTS, which gives it a solid foundation with long-term support stretching all the way to April 2029, and legacy support continuing until 2036. But what the developers at Linux FX have done on top of that Ubuntu base is remarkable. They have built a desktop using KDE Plasma that is themed so precisely to resemble Windows 11 that users who have tested it have reported genuine moments of forgetting which operating system they were running. The taskbar is centered at the bottom with rounded corners and a frosted glass blur effect. The start menu opens from the center bottom, just like Windows 11. The system sounds, the icon pack, the window animations, and even the wallpapers are all crafted to mirror the Windows 11 aesthetic as closely as possible. Linux FX ships with Linux kernel 6.14 and KDE Plasma 5.27, and despite the heavy theming, the system runs with impressive speed, especially on older hardware that would struggle or outright refuse to run Windows 11. The distribution also includes an application called WineHQ pre-installed and configured, which allows Windows software to run natively on the system. For users who depend on specific Windows programs and are not ready to replace them with Linux alternatives, this is a critical feature. Linux FX is also free to download and use, which makes it an accessible option for anyone who does not want to spend money on software just to escape Microsoft's ecosystem. Critics of Linux FX sometimes note that the heavy Windows theming can make the system feel less like a true Linux environment. But for the 99% of people leaving Windows who just want something familiar and functional, that criticism completely misses the point. These people are not trying to become Linux experts. They are trying to keep their computer working without paying Microsoft a subscription fee to do it. The 4th distro is Anduin OS, and this one deserves far more attention than it currently gets. Anduin OS was created by a former Microsoft engineer, which immediately tells you something important about its design philosophy. This is a person who understood Windows deeply, understood what made it work well for everyday users, and then chose to build something better. Anduin OS is based on Ubuntu and uses the GNOME desktop environment, but the interface has been customized so thoroughly that it presents itself with a workflow and visual language that Windows 11 users will find immediately comfortable. The taskbar sits at the bottom, the app launcher behaves similarly to the Windows Start menu, and the overall system feels clean and modern without being alien. What separates Anduin OS from pure visual clones like Linux FX is that it focuses on building familiarity through workflow design rather than pixel-for-pixel copying of Windows aesthetics. The goal is to make you feel productive in the same way you felt productive on Windows, not just to fool your eyes into thinking you have not switched. Anduin OS 1.3 introduced native FlatHub integration, which solves one of the biggest criticisms of earlier versions. Previously, installing applications without using the terminal was not as simple as it should have been for a distro targeting Windows migrants. With FlatHub built in, users now have access to thousands of graphical applications that install with a single click, which brings the experience much closer to what Windows users expect from a modern operating system. Anduin OS is also very privacy-focused, with telemetry stripped out and no corporate data collection practices baked into the system. For anyone leaving Windows specifically, because of Microsoft's aggressive data harvesting, Anduin OS delivers a clean slate that does not replace one surveillance system with another. Distro number 5 is KDE Neon, and this one is for people who want the most customizable Windows-like experience available on Linux without doing any of the heavy customization work themselves. KDE Neon is developed directly by the KDE team, the same people who build the Plasma desktop environment. This means when you install KDE Neon, you're getting Plasma in its purest, most up-to-date form, always with the newest features and the most recent polish applied the moment it becomes available. The KDE Plasma desktop is arguably the most Windows-like desktop environment in the entire Linux world without any additional theming. It comes with a taskbar at the bottom, a start menu-style application launcher, a system tray, virtual desktops, extensive right-click functionality, and a settings panel that is just as comprehensive and organized as the Windows control panel that experienced users remember fondly. What makes KDE Plasma particularly powerful for Windows users is the sheer depth of its customization engine. Every element of the desktop can be adjusted, resized, moved, or replaced. You You can make it look like Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows 11, or something entirely original, all without installing any additional software. KDE Neon ships with the latest Plasma release, currently featuring KDE Plasma 6.5.5, with the most recent KDE frameworks and Qt 6.9. The base of the system is built on Ubuntu 24.04 LTS, which means the underlying stability is rock solid even though the desktop layer is always cutting edge. KDE Neon employs a targeted rolling release approach, meaning only the KDE-related packages update frequently, while the Ubuntu base stays stable underneath. This is an elegant solution that gives you the best of both worlds, a reliable foundation with a constantly improving desktop experience layered on top of it. KDE Neon is not the flashiest option on this list for complete beginners, but for anyone who is moderately comfortable with computers and wants a Linux experience that is both deeply familiar and deeply powerful, it is an exceptional choice. The sixth distro is Q4 OS, and this one might surprise you because it is solving a problem that most of the other distros on this list do not even acknowledge. Most Windows-like Linux distributions are designed around the Windows 10 or Windows 11 aesthetic, with modern visuals and relatively recent hardware requirements. Q4 OS takes a completely different approach. It is designed for users who feel most at home with the Windows XP or Windows 7 interface, and it is built to run beautifully on hardware that would be considered ancient by modern standards. Q4 OS is based on Debian, which is one of the most stable Linux bases available. It uses the Trinity desktop environment, which is a modern continuation of the KDE 3 desktop from the early 2000s, and the resemblance to Windows XP and Windows 7 is genuinely striking for users of a certain age. The taskbar, the start menu, the file manager, the icon style, everything about Q4 OS triggers immediate recognition for anyone who spent years working in Windows XP or Windows 7. The RAM and processor requirements for Q4 OS are extraordinarily low by modern standards, making it one of the best options available for reviving older computers that cannot run Windows 10 or Windows 11 at all. Q4 OS also includes something called the Desktop Profiler, which allows users to switch between a Windows-like layout and other options with minimal effort. It ships with a built-in Windows application installer that uses Wine to run Windows software, configured through a simple graphical interface that does not require any command line knowledge. For users who are attached to older hardware or who simply prefer the classic Windows aesthetic that they used for decades before Microsoft started redesigning everything, Q4 OS is one of the most underrated distributions available today. It is not trying to be modern. It is trying to be familiar, reliable, and fast, and it succeeds completely on all three counts. The seventh distro on this list is Basite, and this is the one that has been making serious waves in 2025 and 2026, particularly among users who want to replace Windows for gaming without giving up the massive Steam library they have spent years building. Basite is based on Fedora and uses an immutable file system architecture, which is a technical detail that translates into one simple real-world benefit for users. The system cannot be broken by bad updates or misconfigured software because every update can be rolled back instantly to a previous state with a single command. For Windows users who have lived through the experience of an update, destroying their system at the worst possible moment, this feature alone is enormously appealing. Basite uses the KDE Plasma desktop by default, which gives it the familiar Windows-like layout that most users need to feel comfortable. It comes pre-configured with Steam, Proton, and a suite of gaming compatibility tools that allow the vast majority of Windows games to run on Linux without any additional setup. The Proton compatibility layer, developed by Valve, has reached a level of maturity in 2026. Tens of thousands of Windows games run on Linux with performance that matches or occasionally exceeds what Windows delivers on the same hardware. Basite recognizes this and ships everything pre-configured so that a Windows user can install it, open Steam, and start playing games within minutes. No terminal commands, no compatibility layer research, no driver hunting. It just works in a way that would have seemed impossible for Linux gaming just 5 years ago. Basite also runs on Steam Deck hardware natively, which gives it an enthusiastic and active community that produces helpful guides, tutorials, and support resources at a pace that benefits desktop users as well. If the primary reason you have been reluctant to leave Windows is your game library, Basite is the distro that removes that last remaining barrier. Now, before you close this video and go download one of these, there are a few things every person switching from Windows needs to know. First, none of these distros will run your Windows applications natively without some form of compatibility layer like Wine or Proton. Most popular applications have Linux native alternatives that are free and fully capable. But if there is a specific Windows program you absolutely cannot live without, you need to verify its compatibility before committing to a full switch. Websites like ProtonDB and WineHQ maintain searchable databases of Windows applications and their Linux compatibility status, and spending 10, Minutes checking those databases before you switch could save you hours of frustration later. Second, every single distro on this list can be tested from a USB drive before you install anything on your computer. This is called a live session, and it lets you run the entire operating system directly from the USB stick without touching your hard drive. You can check that your Wi-Fi works, that your audio plays correctly, that your display resolution is right, and that your printer is detected all before you make any permanent changes. This step is not optional. It is the most important thing you can do to make sure your hardware is compatible before committing. Third, if you're not ready to fully abandon Windows yet, every distro on this list supports dual boot installation, which means you can keep your existing Windows installation exactly as it is and simply add a Linux alongside it. You choose which operating system to boot into every time you turn on your computer. This lets you transition gradually, spending more time in Linux as your comfort grows without the anxiety of having burned your bridges. The Linux ecosystem in 2026 is more capable, more polished, and more welcoming Windows users than it has ever been at any point in its history. Microsoft made the decision to push millions of people out of their comfort zone with hardware requirements most people cannot meet, and a level of data collection that most people are no longer willing to accept. These 7 distributions exist precisely to catch those people and give them something better. Not just something different, something actually better. Faster boot times, no forced updates at inconvenient moments, background telemetry, no mandatory Microsoft account, no subscription fees, and a desktop that feels like home from the very first day. The only real question is which one fits your specific situation. And now you have everything you need to make that decision. Pick the one that matches your hardware, your workflow, and your comfort level, download it, burn it to a USB drive, and take it for a test run. The 99% of people leaving Windows in 2026 are not going back. And after you spend a week with any of these distros, you will understand exactly why. One more thing that does not get enough attention when people discuss switching from Windows to Linux is the software replacement question, and it deserves a direct answer here. The most common concern people raise is about Microsoft Office. They have been using Word, Excel, and PowerPoint for years, and the thought of losing those applications feels like losing part of their workflow. The answer in 2026 is LibreOffice, which is pre-installed on nearly every distro listed here, and it handles the overwhelming majority of Office tasks without any issues. It opens and saves in Microsoft Office formats. It has a familiar ribbon-style interface in its latest versions. And for the standard document editing, spreadsheet work, and presentation creation that most people actually do, it is functionally indistinguishable from Microsoft Office. Users who need the full Microsoft 365 cloud experience, the web versions of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint work perfectly in any Linux browser, including Firefox and Chrome, because they are web applications that do not depend on your operating system at all. The browser compatibility question is even simpler. Chrome, Firefox, Brave, Edge, and virtually every mainstream browser runs natively on Linux with full feature parity to the Windows versions. Streaming services including Netflix, YouTube, Spotify, and Disney Plus work perfectly in these browsers without any additional configuration. Video conferencing through Zoom, Google Meet, and Microsoft Teams all have native Linux applications or work flawlessly through the browser. The everyday computing experience in 2026 on Linux is not a compromise. For the vast majority of what people actually do on computers, browsing, streaming, document editing, email, and video calls, Linux delivers exactly the same experience as Windows, without the bloat, without the surveillance, and without the forced hardware upgrades that millions of people simply cannot afford. The Linux community has spent the last decade making this transition as smooth as possible, and in 2026, they have genuinely succeeded.